Hello, everyone. Good afternoon for some, maybe good morning still. But great to have you on our webinar today about employee engagement. A topic that I personally feel very much attracted to, as I'm a founder of a company myself. I have a team and I'm also active in HR. A really interesting topic. And especially, I think, in the era in which we are living now and in 2022. Before I'm going to tell you what's on the agenda today, and I'm of course going to also let everyone here in the call introduce themselves. I wanted to briefly explain why it's so important to focus on employee engagement. At the moment, 54% of all European employees actually feel disengaged at work. And I think in this war for talent, as we all know, if people feel less engaged, they're more tend to leave the company. It decreases your productivity at the work floor. It has a huge impact on mental well-being, and I think mental well-being, fortunately, is a topic that becomes more urgent compared to a couple of years ago. So it's an important one, but it tends to be quite an intangible topic for a lot of companies, and I think we've also seen that in the number of subscriptions today. So really great to see the interest there. What we will discuss today is a couple of topics. First, we will explain how to get started with employee engagement. How do you measure it? How do you keep track of it? What are the indicators, whether it's going well or whether it's not going so well? Also, of course, what do we understand what do we mean with employee engagement? I think employee engagement covers a lot of different components, and I think each of us maybe has a preference or maybe a top three on, hey, what is most important when it comes to employee engagement? We are going to talk about useful tooling and strategies to improve it. And last but not least, the role of diversity, equality, and inclusion on employee engagement. My name is Charlotte. I am one of the founders of Equalture, which is an HR tech startup based in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And what we do is we help companies make unbiased hiring decisions by gamifying the hiring process. So instead of letting people apply with a resume, we let candidates complete a couple of neuroscientific games that allow them to showcase their skills, their talents, their cultural preferences, and so on. And as I mentioned, we are a team of 30 people ourselves now, planning to grow to 60. So employee engagement is also, for me personally, is a topic that is really important here. And also, to be fair, something relatively new for me. So really looking forward to learn from you guys as well today. I have three amazing panelists today. Instead of me introducing them, I think you're always best at introducing yourself. So Lexie, I wanted to start with you.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Lexie Papaspyrou and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Tech Talent Charter. The Tech Talent Charter is an industry collaborative not-for-profit. We're funded by the UK government, and our intention is to try and make the tech economy of the UK a more diverse and inclusive place. We do that by working with some 600 and growing UK-based organisations with a tech footprint in the UK, and we provide free resources to help those companies with their diversity and inclusion efforts.
Great, thank you. Andy, would you like to take over?
Sure. I'm Andy Bibby. I'm the CEO of 8to7%. We are a company that focuses on mental health. So we've developed an ecosystem that allows companies and the people who work within it to measure, understand, and improve their mental health. Measurement is key for us because it allows us to personalize and to help organizations really understand where to start. And we know that mental health and engagement are tightly connected. We also know that mental health, diversity, inclusion, all of those strategies that you have are tightly connected. So if you can measure mental health, then you're really on your way to really understanding how to engage with each entity within your organization as a separate entity, rather than taking a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, which as organizations grow, it just simply doesn't work as effectively as something more tailored.
Cool, thank you. And last but not least, we have Robin. And to give the credit to you, Robin, you're of course managing director at Spinks. I'm not going to introduce you now, but Spinks is the partner that we are organizing this webinar with. And you guys came up with the topic of employee engagement and emphasize the urgency of the topic. So credits to Spinks for getting this event organized. And I hand it over to you now, Robin.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, I'm Managing Director of Spinks. Spinks is part of the Harvey Nash Group. They're a very large international staffing and technology business. And within that group, Spinks is the brand that focuses on the startup scale-up place space. That's across UK and continental Europe. Employee engagement, Charlotte, just as you said, is so important. For us, we're scaling, we're growing. You know, we're moving into Amsterdam and Berlin ourselves, and we're looking at the scale of ourselves. But equally, it's so important for the founders and CEOs that we speak to on a daily basis. It really is. If you get employee engagement right, your company will grow, and if you don't, it won't. So that's why we kind of really want to come to you with the topic today.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. One practical note before we dive into the actual topics around employee engagement. There is a chat functionality here in the tool. There's also a questions tab. If you have any questions for one of the panelists, or if you have a comment that you would like to discuss here, feel free to put it in the chat or in the questions tab. I will try to keep track of that during the webinar to squeeze in the questions that are relevant for the conversation now. And of course, we will have a Q&A at the end as well. So before diving into how to measure employee engagement, where to start, I think also for me personally, employee engagement is tends to be quite a buzzword. Like, we all talk about it, but it can be quite intangible to really say, hey, what is employee engagement? What components does it cover? What makes employee engagement within your organization? So maybe, Robin, I wanted to start with you. What would you say are the most crucial components of employee engagement? Or what is it that pops up into your mind when you think about employee engagement?
It's an interesting perspective, actually, that, Charlotte, because you talk about it being a buzzword, so it's maybe more of a word on trend right now. But I think also companies are thinking much more about their employees now. You know, I certainly feel we're doing a lot more within Spinks and also within the wider Harvey Nash Group to think about employees. So what does it mean to me? It really means that we are thinking about our employees all the time, and we're thinking about how we do engage and connect with our employees. We're making sure that our employees' well-being and mental health is paramount to us as a business. But we're also thinking about how we create careers, I think, for our employees. And that's a big part, I think, for me, about that employee engagement. They're not just here to support the business's growth. We actually, in return, have to support their growth, give them the right nutrients to be able to grow as well. So that's what employee engagement means to me.
Yep, I completely agree. Hey, Andy, what I think is interesting with regards to employee engagement is the mental well-being component, and you know all about it. Would you agree with me if I'm saying that if you compare it to, I don't know, 10 to 5 years ago, mental well-being, employee well-being has significantly increased in terms of urgency for companies? I have the feeling that's maybe that has also something to do with COVID, but that we tend to have way more focus on mental well-being than we used to have a couple of years ago.
Yeah, no doubt. We started thinking about this in 2016. We did some work in 2017, and we actually formally launched the organization in 2018, and we've been collecting data since, because we deal with a lot of data and insight. So we've seen, even over that time, attitudes to mental health change. And the pandemic really forced organizations to think about it. And we actually see ourselves in sort of the third phase of it. In 2020, when the pandemic hit, very little budgets in place, not that many, not kind of focused staff, and people scrambled. People were at home, they needed support. They were dealing with all sorts of issues in the home, and everybody was different, and they were suddenly forced back to work from home. And we saw companies scramble. Then in 2021, we saw a lot more organization. We saw budgets coming into place. We saw headcount coming into place, and that allowed people to take a more structured approach to mental health, mental well-being, which is tightly connected to engagement. now where we are in kind of coming into 2022 is, at least the clients we're working with, it's all about measurement. It's all about saying, well, actually, I'm spending all of this money. We're doing this. Is it working? Are people using the features that we've put in place? And so we're working with a lot of clients on understanding gender, age group differences, ethnicity, and how that's all coming out to play as the pandemic also is, we're coming into sort of end of year 2 into year 3. And when we think about engagement, and I think about it both as a CEO of an organization and also the way in which we connect it to mental health, we think about it as caring. We want employees to care about the business, and we want the business to care about the employees. And if you've got that relationship where I show I care about you and you show that you're caring about the business, then you've got true engagement because people are thinking about it. So that's how we define engagement. We think about it as caring. And if you care for your employees and you show that you care for them in everything that they do, they will give you back in terms of their engagement, their thinking, and they will show that they care in return. So that's kind of how we think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. Lexie, anything that has not been said about employee engagement up so far that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, Andrew, I like what you were just saying there around, like, when you look at employee engagement, what does it mean? And when I think about it, particularly with the companies that we tend to talk to at Tech Talent Charter, engagement is kind of like a proxy in a way for two concepts: commitment and trust. And the relationship between employer and employee is obviously predicated on having really to have the best possible commitment and trust mutually between each other. And employee engagement is everything that goes into trying to facilitate having the best versions of commitment and trust between an employee and an employer. And obviously the reason why this is a really big business concern, if we just look at it from the point of view of, what does the bottom line say? If you have low commitment and low trust between an employee and employer, you are going to see higher attrition. You're going to see your retention is damaged. You're going to be spending more on recruitment. So this is a very real, there's financial incentive for getting employee engagement right. And there's also a good ethical and responsible point that Andrew was making, which is just that, it's about caring for people and being a human. I think more than anything we've seen in the last couple of years, how important that is. And actually that kind of outlook is on the rise, and that's great.
Charlotte, can I say something? So
Absolutely.
It's really interesting, actually, Andrew, because when we've kind of set up very recently employee engagement surveys and doing more work around that side of things. And I think initially it's not mistrust, but there was a bit of why are we suddenly doing this? But that element you talked about, the caring, I think if we had actually maybe described that at the outset of this is us caring, I think that would have translated very well. Because there is always understanding, why are you suddenly doing this? Why is this suddenly of interest when, and we talk to a lot of, obviously I talk to a lot of founders of startups and scale-ups, and their focus is on so many different things, in investment, getting the MVP out, everything else. But of course, employees have to be important. But I think that just that subject of caring is a good way to label it.
Yeah, I try and think about it. People ask me, why did it get involved in the business? Why did we start the business? And I come down to a very personal story. I have 2 daughters who are just entering the workforce. And the reality is I don't want them working for a company who doesn't care about them, who is going to sweat them to the bone and then cast them aside. That is not what business is about. And it's not how I represent myself. And so I think about, because I'm a technologist by training, I'm not a psychologist, I have no medical training at all. I know how to use technology. And I wanted to say, okay, well, how could I use technology to make the workplace better, not just for my kids, but for everybody's kids, and really shine a light on the data and the importance of why organizations should care, and actually commitment and trust, Lexie, huge parts of that, and we see that right across. But why should you? Because there's huge business benefits. We talk about a concept called philanthrocapitalism, which is really about companies investing in the societies that surround them, and why that's a good thing. And so it's just all interconnected. But that's kind of why sort of caring is very personal to me, because I want my daughters to be safe at work.
Really cool. Hey, and you mentioned data, Andy. I think that's a nice bridge to the first topic of our deep dive in employee engagement. I think that everything around people-related manners in your organization start with measuring, knowing what's going on, knowing what's at least your starting point and where you would like to go to. Does any of you have experiences with certain tooling, strategies, activities? You already mentioned surveys, Robin, to get started with this, to create an overview of how the organization is doing in terms of employee engagement.
I don't mind taking that, Charlotte. We have an assessment platform, very easy. It talks to Lexie's point about trust. It actually can be completely anonymous, and we take people through an assessment that gives them a score across 35 areas of their life, work-life balance, anxiety, depression, health. So we get a very good picture. We look at that through the lens of demographics, and we're able to give organizations that starting point. So you get that starting point. Each individual gets their own report, so they get something back. The organization, we have behavioral scientists look at it, and we give the organization just a heat map of where they are. Because if you know where you are, no matter what kind of initiatives you're doing, particularly if you're doing employee engagement, you can measure the result of that. I always say, look, you wouldn't go on a diet without stepping on the scales on day one. But our businesses often go down roads of initiatives. They often do things without actually knowing where they started. And then the CEO says, how are we doing? And they scramble and they go, oh yeah, great. And they start to tell stories. But at the end of the day, what you want is that hard data. So we have a tool that gives people that baseline. And, of course, I'm here to talk about employee engagement, but anyone who wants to contact me, 87%, and we can talk about it.
Cool, thanks, Andy. Hey, Robin, what did you do? Because you said we started with sending out a survey. Did you ask people to rate certain aspects of the workforce? Or?
So yeah, we use an HR platform called Hive HR, and we do a employee engagement survey 3 times a year, and that's globally across the group. And then what we really focus on is obviously collecting that data, and that's really useful for us as a senior leadership team to be able to understand how engaged our employees are feeling. Obviously that can translate then into how productive they are. But more importantly, the reason why we choose to only do it 3 times a year rather than 4 or 6 is because we actually really want to make meaningful actions from what they actually come up with. And actually that was in our first survey, because we actually did that. We wanted to do a base level of how do employees currently feel before we conduct any initiatives, any plans around making employee engagement better and employee culture really much better. We want to get a base level, and the concern that came up across the group was, will we be listened to? Will these be actioned? Will this, yes, we might be telling you these things, but how much are you actually going to listen to that? And I think that can be translated, it's for our group, but that can be translated to any business, So we now do a real lot of emphasis around actually making sure we are doing meaningful actions based on what we're hearing from our employees. And that, we're now three surveys in, and already that's changing so much. And one way we're noticing it is actually the uptake of people taking those surveys as well. That's coming up. So I think we're at about 75%, where I think day one it was around 30-something%. So I think that is a good indicative of we're making progress.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important. I heard a lot from friends that work at big corporates or whatever. Like we get a survey every quarter, we fill it in, and we have the feeling that it's just getting a spreadsheet and that nothing basically happens with it. So I think it's indeed very good to be aware of, hey, if I'm asking my employees to take time to fill this in, then I should make that promise that I'm actually going to act upon the responses. So yeah, I completely agree. Hey, Robin, quick question for you, because you work with a lot of startups and scale-ups. Two questions actually. When do you usually see, so in which growth stage, whether that's in terms of employees or whatever, do you usually see that people start, or the founding team or the management team starts caring a bit more about employee engagement? And do you think that that's often too late then?
I think it's changing, Charlotte. I think we are, and I think COVID has been an acceleration to that change, or because I think founders are thinking much more about it at a much earlier stage than they had previously, and I'm being very generalist here, but, maybe a couple of years back, founders were thinking very much about, as I say, getting a product out to market, getting employees in to help them on that product, and actually maybe then looking at, raising more investment, along those lines. I'm definitely seeing a significant change in their mindset now around when they should be thinking about employee engagement. And it goes back to Lexie's point there, where there's a financial return on this. Yes, I generally believe they do care, but there is a financial return. We are in a position, we work with a lot of tech startups and scale-ups, and particularly we place technologists in those organizations, which are in so much demand. So if companies aren't thinking about their employees at the outset, and I would say actually at the hiring stage, not even at the onboarding stage, then these candidates have a lot of choice of where they can go. And they will vote with their feet, and they won't go and take those at companies. So I think partly there's a financial perspective in it, but equally I do think there's a better thought from a lot of these founders. A lot of these founders are younger in any way, and they're just thinking a little bit more about how important employee engagement is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the fact that you touched up on the hiring aspect as well, where it starts. Maybe a question for you, Lexie. Do you think that employee engagement should be part of the hiring process? And if yes, then how should it be part of the hiring process for people?
Yeah, I'll answer that one, Charlotte, but then I've got two other things that I just want to add on surveys as well. So should it be part of the hiring process? Well, it depends how you define your employee engagement. Like at what point do you want to start building commitment and trust, and what does that look like? And in the hiring process, I think, we could all take a punt and go, yeah, it should be involved in the hiring process, because that's when you first start building a trusting relationship with the person who's going to be in your business. It's a lot about expectation setting, communicating transparently, and these are all things that you need to have in place if you're going to get employees to disclose things to you that will help you better engage them when they work for you. So it is really crucial that you have this link up and sense of continuity, a sense of clear expectation around the level of transparency, trust, and accountability that the business has for making sure the employee feels comfortable and included. So that's my answer to your direct question, but I also just want to circle back quickly. I know Robin and Andrew have both talked about surveys, and I would say, like, that's what we hear a lot when people are trying to run listening activities in their business. A survey is a really easy way to do it, and it doesn't really matter how deep your pockets are. There are always ways of running surveys, but I would just say, so when we look at startups and scale-ups, it's a really low barrier to access way to start listening to your employees, is to create your own survey. You can do it for free with just a little bit of time in creating a survey. And there are loads of great templates out there. We've got some in our open playbook that can help you start to ask questions to understand how your employees are feeling. But I'd also just like to mention that something that we do hear from companies that are trying to encourage their employees to disclose information about their level of engagement is that it can sometimes be hard to encourage higher disclosure rates if it's something new that you're doing, and if it's in-house and you haven't done it before. So I think there's a benefit to just shouting out that sometimes using a third-party platform to understand in a first instance what is going on to establish a baseline is not a bad thing, because sometimes it can help initiate the practice in your business of collecting this kind of information in a way where that data is separated and not being looked at by, say, the HR person who signs off a promotion or a pay rise or something like that. So there are benefits to the nature of how you do a survey or a listening activity, depending on the particular type of problem that you might expect to see with your workforce, wherever you are in the journey of starting a listening process.
Yeah, absolutely. And also completely agree on what you're saying. Like employee engagement is not something that you could start without any budget. So indeed, a budget should never be an excuse to not work on it. And it's interesting what you're saying about third party perspective, indeed, because I can imagine that it makes people feel a bit more like, hey, okay, there's an external party objective going to look at the data. So really fair point. You mentioned something about a playbook. I'm going to make sure that people receive that. If you can maybe send it over to me after the webinar, then people have some inspiration maybe to get started.
Yep, it's on our website for free and anyone can access it. So I'll send it out.
Ah, cool. Great. Hey, Robin, you, of course, help a lot of companies with hiring. I touched up on the topic already a couple of minutes ago. Should employee engagement be part of hiring? I definitely think it should. But how do you do that? Because you are an external party, you get inside of the company and you're going to help them with hiring. How do you advise them to include this component in the hiring process? And how do you execute it yourself as well?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think what we try and do is make sure it is part of our very, very first conversation with clients who are maybe looking to use the Spinks business. And we ask that question very much, we want to know what their vision, their value, the purpose of their business is, because this is what our candidates want to know. They of course, they're interested in, the financial package, what the technology they may be working with, but actually now there's a lot more that comes into this when they're making decisions around where they're going to be working. And we're seeing it happen more and more that they're generally interested in what this company stands for. What is that purpose of that organization? So we make it really, really a key focus of when we're talking about, the job description and what they're looking for out of for this candidate. We're equally asking, well, what is in it for the candidate to take these jobs? It really needs to be a two-way conversation around that. And there seems to be a lot of willingness from many founders and talent teams that we speak to on this. And we do get a little bit more. We have another brand of ours, which is our on-site solution, where we physically sit on site with startups and really help them scale. And that's where we can really, I think, even more value, Charlotte, because that's where we really get involved with the hiring managers, with the CEO, and really get to understand their business, because we're physically, with COVID permitting, we're physically sitting on site with them on a daily basis and understanding that. So that's how we support. And then we make sure that we are speaking to the candidates about that. It's really, really important that we are aligning the candidates from a technology perspective and a job perspective, but also really much from a culture perspective as well. And I think that helps with the retention as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's a really good point. Mental well-being is a very important component of employee engagement, but it's also definitely the value alignment, that you believe in the same purpose of the company. And I think, by the way, there are also a lot of companies that still have the mindset that candidates need to sell themselves during a hiring process. Well, I personally really believe in the importance of you also selling your value, your purpose in a fair way. Of course, you shouldn't overpromise or overdo that. But Andy, how are you doing that in your own hiring process? Because you, of course, I think you are with around 40 to 50 people now. So you've made a couple of hires already. How do you do this?
We are still reasonably old school. We're so all of the senior team will make sure that they interview an employee. We look at making sure that the cultural fit is as tight as possible. So we look to make sure that they get a full rounded process in the interview process. We're lucky. I mean, we're working in mental health, so we are very much at the forefront, but we have a social cause. Our mission is to increase the mental well-being of society percent by percent, and people can really buy into that mission, and we can talk to them about how we achieve that, the technology that we deploy, what we do in front of clients, and we find that people will automatically engage with what we are doing, and we look for that. We are looking for people who want to come on the journey with us. We often talk about passion for the subject, passion for helping people and for understanding. And so if you kind of feel that in that candidate, then we know that we'll work well together. So we are somewhat lucky because we can talk about our mission, and we can see if there's a connection there. And that tends to be how we do it. You know, we are definitely still a startup, so everybody gets to do a little bit of everything, and so you need a little bit of resilience, I think, when you work for a startup, because life is not as regimented as perhaps it is in a bigger organization. You've got to be more dynamic, you've got to be more flexible, and if you've got passion for the subject, then actually you don't mind doing some of those things. So that's kind of how we approach it. Of course, we have psychologists on staff, so we get a little bit of insight into the candidates through that as well, because they're naturally sort of talking to people and thinking about them as part of the interview process. So not that I'd suggest that you have clinical psychologists involved in your recruitment process. We just happen to have it as a matter of course because they're part of our senior team.
Yeah, and that definitely helps.
It does help.
I have a question that is completely off the script. We didn't discuss this up front, but it came up when you were mentioning, of course, we are mental well-being, so people feel very much aligned with what we do already when they apply. I think here at Equalture, my company is also in sort of luxury position because we started this company with, well, our mission statement is we want to shape the world of unbiased hiring, make sure that everyone gets an equal opportunity to get hired. And I think as a result of that automatically attracts a lot of people that are very purpose-driven. And it also results in the fact that we have a very tight team and that everyone is so aligned with what we are doing as a company that some sort of automatically maybe covers one component of employee engagement. Do you guys think, and I'm going to leave it open who's going to answer it, that employee engagement can be easier or harder if there's, for example, a societal impact component to your company, or if your company has a very clear purpose-driven mission versus maybe a company that is, well, I'm not going to provide any examples, by the way. You know what I mean, I think.
I'd like to jump in on this one because focusing on what Tech Talent Charter does, we're a diversity and inclusion organisation. So we're a mission-driven organisation, and we help other organisations improve their diversity. And in tech, one of the key lenses is women in tech. There are fewer women in tech than compared to almost any other baseline that you would look at where women are. So we often have organisations querying, well, how do we attract more women? How do we engage more women so that we can hire them? And there are differences. So to answer your question, Charlotte, like mission is really important, but it depends who you're trying to engage. So there are some really interesting pieces of research. The Institute of Coding did a piece with KPMG, I think, which showed that women and girls are far more likely to be influenced in their job choices if you are talking about your mission and your societal impact. So that's just one example, but there are lots of studies that show different facets of how to engage people differently. And there's another one actually that's just come out very recently by We Are the City, and they surveyed women working in tech and found that the biggest influencer was salary, which is what you would hope. But the second one, which was almost exactly the same percentage score, was having an engaged manager. So the ways that you look at engagement really influence the types of, they can really influence different types of people. So depending on what your talent strategy looks like and what your priorities are, that can be a super interesting avenue to explore.
Yeah, and this is a really important point, Lexie, around management, and that we look at and measure kind of holistic mental health, but we also look at it from the point of view of a company. And we know people leave managers, they tend not to leave companies. And so we do a lot of education. We actually have an online course that is about mental health for managers, how to kind of really understand that, because that holistic piece, everybody brings their whole self to work and take their whole self home again. And sometimes that's just through the door, or sometimes actually just sat on the same couch. So that sort of that distance between home and work has collapsed in a lot of places. But it's this notion of equality. We work with a lot of diversity and inclusion teams, really, because we're able to look at the data and show if you have any sort of issues, you can highlight that data. But that management piece is so critical to engagement. If your manager couldn't be bothered, then pretty much is the team, his or her team, are not going to be bothered either.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I really like the training component that you do for managers as well. It's something that we, for example, also do with our platform. So you can buy the platform as a part of the onboarding. We give managers a training on unconscious bias and how can you make sure that you reduce that in an interview and etc. Because we see that a lot of companies that we work for also have very young managers, so they're less experienced with this topic. So I think that making sure that the managers are aligned and educated is super important. Do you see, Robin, again, because you work with a lot of young companies, do you see this being an issue often, that young teams, young managers are less experienced in this topic?
It's exactly that, and it's just less experience because, as I say, they're potentially, they are younger in their managerial careers. So is that less experience? So yeah, we absolutely do have a focus actually around engaging with the managers to make sure that they feel that they are properly equipped to conduct those interviews. Because again, interviews are never something that people actually put on part of the job description. Typically, is it something that happens to them, and typically they don't get any training around that. So they go in with maybe seems to have someone else is interviewed and just copying their traits, and that isn't necessarily the right way to be conducting those interviews. So we definitely do quite a bit of work around those elements, especially when we notice it during the process. And you're actually absolutely right, Lexie, that point around I don't know if you said people leave managers rather than companies. We see the same when hiring. People will choose those hirings, not necessarily also the company, on that person who's hiring them and that manager. Can I work with that individual? Does that person, am I inspired by that individual? Does that, and that side of things, and they make those decisions on that basis. Yeah. And just going back to your other point, Charlotte, about the societal impact, I think it's too easy to just say, if you're a company that is a tech for good or in that societal impact thing, that it's much easier than to hire. I still think it's about the people within those businesses and how they believe they're doing right by their employees.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. Hey, we talked a lot about hiring, and I think a topic that I also want to discuss is onboarding as a next step then. What we, for example, do here at Equalture is we have 3 stages of our onboarding, and we don't necessarily say, hey, within X weeks you need to be finished with your onboarding, but we give you 3 milestones, and you can take as much time as you want to complete those milestones. And the first milestone is always getting to know the company and the team, the why behind what we are doing, and to make sure that the alignment is there from the first week. And that's just an example of how we are doing it. But I'm very curious whether you guys have any best practices or learnings, because you are onboarding a lot of people yourself as well in your organizations. What are you doing to make sure that from day one people feel that employee engagement is an important topic?
I can take that initially. So I'll talk about it from our perspective, and I'll talk to you a bit about from our client's perspective. So we do a week-long onboarding strategy. We make sure that they meet with as many people as we feel are right from a Spinks perspective to make sure they really get a feel for us. We do that through the interview process. So a lot of it is just then meeting these people again as they're onboarding. But we also do it from a group perspective as well. So we really make sure they understand their role, where they fit within our business, but also where our business then fits within the group. So they get a really clear understanding of that. We do a lot also at their onboarding stage. They get a kind of a handbook where we talk about, our vision, our values, but also they get the career pathways in that handbook as well. So they can really see straight away that we are thinking from day one, not just their passing their probation, but actually what happens past probation. How does their career evolve within our organization? But I would say it's evolving. I don't think we're perfect at it. I think it's a continuous learning process. And from our clients' perspective, I think one of the dangers is a lot of companies think a lot more now about hiring. They're much more aware of unconscious bias at the hiring stage, but that needs to be carried through into the onboarding stage as well. And I think that still isn't there completely at the moment, in my opinion. Yeah.
What do you see that goes wrong then?
I think from some of the companies that I think we've engaged with, I think they think a lot about unconscious bias because they're kind of told to think about it at the hiring stage, and it's very, very important to help attract that talent. And then it's not always matched within those organizations. And a lot of startups, I understand that, you know, they are challenged in so many different ways. Andrew, you talked about how many different hats these people have to wear. You've got to be really passionate and really involved to want to, you know, jump into that. So I think sometimes that employee engagement piece can get a little bit lost during the onboarding, and then they're there and they suddenly feel that that's not exactly what they had during the hiring process, and there's that disconnect. And, you know, there's obviously that very well known stat that, you know, the majority of people, if they're going to leave a business, they leave in those first 3 months. They really are challenged in those first 3 months. And that's what I consider to be the onboarding. I don't see onboarding just being, you know, your first week. I actually see that onboarding really being a longer period of time of that. So I think that's where companies need to still do more.
Yeah, I think there's some real dynamics around onboarding happening now. You've got to look at the individual. Is this their first job, or do they have 30 years of experience? We were doing a study around first workers with a lot of the bigger organizations. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit and we were not able to continue that work. But what we understand is that when you leave a university and go to work for the first time, that's a massive change. You're suddenly going to find that your salary doesn't nearly go as far as you thought it was. And there's all sorts of pressures. You might be away from home for the first time. So we want to look at the individual and their circumstances around that. We also now are looking at, well, if you're working from home, we took on people that we didn't meet face to face for 9 months. You know, so you've got to look at them. Are they working at home, or are they living on their own? So how do they need, you know, what kind of support should you need to get for those individuals? So we want to look at them in terms of their individual circumstances, because that's going to allow you to engage with them a lot more. That's going to allow you to show that you're building that trust. You're showing that you're understanding them as an individual. So it's not, we don't see it as, here's our onboarding process. We want to take more of an individualistic look at that and to say, okay, let's understand that individual and move that forward. That's how we're approaching it. But we're a much smaller organization, so we can do that because that's scalable for us. You know, we're not the size of Robin's organization.
No, that's a fair point. Hey, I see one question coming in the chat, and after that I would like to move on to the last topic as we have 15 minutes left. But Yolanda is saying, and thanks for putting in the question, Yolanda. The first month seems to be the highest risk for engagement of employees because employees want to experience a match with their expectations created in the hiring phase. In my opinion, the onboarding process needs 3 months at least. What does the panel think of that? Now, I do have an opinion myself as well, but I would like to hear your opinions first.
I guess for us, it's sort of, well, is there a line between onboarding and working? The reality is that from day one, you're learning. And I think that you should always be learning on the job. You have to learn a lot more during the onboarding because you've got some basic things that you need to put in place. But I think 3 months, yeah, sure. Actually making sure that you follow up, or you do skip level one-on-ones where you can try and figure out, make sure that person remains connected to the mission and the vision and that they've had the kind of experience. So absolutely, there are some things that you need to do. So the administration of onboarding and the basics of onboarding. But then I think actually you're into this constant learning. I also think sometimes organizations, at least the onboarding process is maybe to make that person think a bit more like the organization. Whereas I've always taken the approach that when you bring someone new into the organization, it's an enormous opportunity for the organization to learn from the individual. So the organization should become a bit more like that individual that they've just brought on board, as opposed to trying to make that person like you. That's not why you hired them in the first place. At least for us, we want their experience, we want their talent, we want their thinking, and therefore we don't want to say, oh, well, this is actually how you do it, because they may come up with a much better idea. So I think for the question, sure, I think, yeah, much longer time, and it's about constant learning on the job.
Yeah. Well, my personal view on this is I don't know if I'm a big fan of putting some sort of a timeline on onboarding, because I think onboarding goes at but again, we are also a small organization, so we can afford doing it like that. But some of our employees take a much longer time for onboarding than others do. So I think it's more about what we want people to get out of it and let them choose their own pace and how they're doing it. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that employee engagement, of course, doesn't stop after the onboarding. So I think that transition is also a fair one to keep in mind. Although I find it a very important and relevant topic, I did want to cover one other topic, and I also see one question from you, Arthur, coming up in the chat, so we're going to answer that in a bit. But Lexie, especially since you're in the panel also today, people are writing a lot more about diversity, equality, and inclusion in relation to employee engagement. What would you say is the impact of diversity and equality and inclusion on this topic?
It's a really interesting one. I think there's a bit of a cycle really that exists here between employee engagement and diversity and inclusion. Something that's really top of my mind at the moment is that the Tech Talent Charter is about to release our annual diversity and tech report. So we've got sort of 600 companies that have shared this data with us that is not usually available around diversity and inclusion in their businesses, which includes loads of rich data around what they're doing to actually engage their employees. And something that we keep hearing coming up is that companies want to understand and hear more from their employees about how they feel and what can be done better to engage them. And data and disclosure rates are a huge issue. Lots of companies do have trouble getting this information from their employees. And the problem is that the employees that don't answer are the ones that you really want to hear from more than anything. So there's this kind of circular thing where if we're trying to look at this link between diversity and inclusion, you can't really assess that very easily unless you have good employee engagement and employees that are, to go back to what I said at the very beginning, are trusting enough in the organization to share personal information about themselves, about their identity, and about how they feel. So there's a huge issue with just being able to measure, what is even going on, where do we start, unless you are working on employee engagement, and that's part of the culture of your business. But then when people then come to look at diversity and inclusion in terms of, well, what can we do as a business to improve that? Engagement is just, again, another thing that comes up time and time again about listening to your employees, understanding what they think and feel. Do they feel they're treated fairly? Is there flexibility that meets their needs? Do they have good career development? Is there good promotion and retention opportunity for them? Is it a safe work environment? So all of these things feed back into this idea of employee engagement. I think the two things are really inseparable.
Yeah, no doubt. I think this is really important. We, as I say, we do a lot of work around this. We find that our assessment is a sort of a health, a well-being assessment. So we see different data, but one of the things that we do is, one, of course, privacy, and the fact that we're often separate from the organization. That is a big thing. So you establish that trust. We know we have aggregation, we have all sorts of ethical use of data policies, lots of things around that piece. But one of the things that we actually find works is we talk about how your data is able to do good for for the general population, you know, research. This is about actually helping improve not just the workplace, but society's understanding of these issues. And when people understand actually, okay, I'm helping, my data can really help, and I understand that my privacy is never going to be used against me, then we certainly see much higher rates of engagement, because we talk about it in how they not just are gaining benefit themselves, but how the wider population is benefiting. And generally, most people want to help. Most people as long as it's not going to do them harm. So that's kind of how we approach it.
Great, thank you. Robin, sorry, you wanted to add something, I think? You only need to get the mute button.
There we go. The dog was barking in the background, so apologies. I completely agree. It's DE and I are absolutely integral parts of our culture, and we've actually, you know, we are in a fortuitous position, being part of a bigger group that we've been able to bring, you know, people in specifically to focus around that, because it is such an important a component. But I think that also comes from the top down. Our group CEO, it is absolutely integral to her that we think this way, and she ensures that it's installed in her leadership team, and then through us to all parts of the business. And I think it's all about celebrating. We do a lot about celebrating our differences as well as our similarities, and I think that's a big part of it as well. And we do have metrics around it. You know, one of the metrics that we use is, you know, I feel that I could be my true self in the workplace, and that's such a powerful message to be able to get across. And you know, we're in a good place. We're not in a perfect place. I think it's about 75% of the people feel they can, but that's still 1/4 of our global team that feel they can't. So that's definitely work to be done. And I think from our clients' perspective, the startups and scale-ups, I think a lot want to do much more around diversity, equality, and inclusion. And we're seeing that happen a lot more. We have a brand within Spinks called You Equal Tech, which we actually work with our clients around encouraging to kind of attend events. You know, again, this is pre-COVID, but hopefully we can return to that, where we talk about building diverse and inclusive working environments. So I think those are important parts as well. I would just add, though, that I feel you still feel with some startups, they are challenged in this space. They are challenged in this space because they are trying to do so much. And obviously, I think they fundamentally want to do more, but it's challenging as they scale very quickly.
Yeah, I completely agree. Ruben, I think there's one question in the chat that is a question that you can answer best, and that's a question from Arthur. And he is asking if you would have to point out one main bottleneck that startups usually face from a hiring perspective, what would it be?
Wow, one bottleneck. I think the interview process is a big bottleneck. I think sometimes companies delve too much on that area, and they don't think about the simplicity of that. And I think in that respect, what they do is quite often people look to identify people that are similar to themselves, rather than thinking about bringing talent in that is actually different to them. And we talk about culture add quite a lot, rather than, you know, and I think that's a really important bit. So I think that is a bottleneck. It's educating those managers around hiring and not looking to hire replicas of themselves, but to bring talent that comes with a lot more than that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Hey, we have 5 minutes left. I always like to end a webinar in a very practical way. Some things that people can take away after the conversation, and that maybe they can start implementing already tomorrow to do something to work on employee engagement to improve it. If you all would have to give the audience one, or if you really can't pick, 2 tips on what they can do to improve their employee engagement, and something that maybe they can start doing already tomorrow, what would it be?
It's an obvious one, but it's around communication. And I've never worked in an organization through any sort of engagement surveys where communication has not come up as a constant topic. And it's a really fine line because it's very difficult. It's impossible to have everybody to know about everything, but everybody wants to know about everything because we're human beings, and and we want to do that. So having the right communication channels, making sure also that those communication channels come right back into the C-suite. So thinking about your communication, and are you communicating well, particularly now if you've got large people in hybrid models or working from home, and you may not necessarily have changed your communication strategy, but you've no longer got people meeting in the kitchen or chatting around the water cooler or whatever it happens to be. Because if people feel communicated to and they feel like they're in the know, then they can engage a lot better. So it's about making sure that if the structure of your business has changed, then make sure you reflect that in your communication. That's one.
Yeah, a really important one, especially I think in this, I want to say post-COVID area, but we are not in post yet, but at least in the hybrid models, extremely important to almost over-communicate, I think. Lexie, would you want to take over?
Yeah, I would say there are things that you can always start doing straight away to improve employee engagement, but you won't finish them quickly. So that's the first thing I would say, is manage your own expectations about doing the prep work. If you get the groundwork right for hiring, for engagement, anything like that, your onboarding, then you will have a resource that you can reuse, and it's worth investing the time upfront to be really thoughtful and considered and intentional about how you're going to start undertaking engagement activity, whatever that means. The second thing that I would say around it really is you have to establish measures. So you have to work out what it is engagement means to you. How are you going to measure it? What is an appropriate proxy for that? So that's all going to be part of your planning and consideration for how you start work on engagement activity. And then the third tip I'll just give is that when you come to actually start taking action around the plans that you make, a practice of humility is really helpful in this area. It is fast changing, new best practices emerging all the time, and invariably all businesses will try to walk a very, very difficult and vague line around what's the right thing for them. So whatever you're doing, position it with transparency to your employees, and position it with humility, such that you can say to them, we are doing our best to walk this balance line. And I'm sure that we might make mistakes at some point, but when we do, we want to hear so that we can correct. And I think humility helps a lot of people to start the engagement process with you.
Absolutely. Thanks.
I think from my perspective, I mean, what Lexie and Andrew said, I really do echo. Communication is so key part of it. And I think that sometimes it's fundamentally where it falls down. The one other thing I would just add is I think employees being recognized for their success, I don't think that always happens as much, and that needs to happen more. So we do a big part around that, and making sure that our employees and they're recognized globally, so they share that success around all the different geographies, the different brands within the group as well. And I think that works really well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Charlotte, if I can just add, because I think Lexie brought up a really important point around measurement, because measurement makes you accountable, and accountability as a senior team is incredibly important. If you don't hold yourselves accountable, well, what's the point in doing it? So you need to show how you're going to be accountable, and measurement, obviously dear to my heart, but Lexie talked about that very eloquently. Measurement is so critical because that is about accountability, and as leaders we must be accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's super relevant. We have someone in our advisory board who's very much focused on HR and hiring practices within scale-ups, and we are working with her on some sort of an NPS kind of model. Like, how can we make sure that we always have an NPS of how happy our employees are, and also where what things are going well and what might be improved. And I think that's indeed very important to set some sort of a baseline for yourself, a target. This is what I want to go to, and make sure that you keep measuring it indeed. So very fair point. It's well, here in the Netherlands it's 1 p.m. So that means we've reached the end of this webinar. I really want to thank you for all the insights. I've learned a lot myself as well, and we are in the middle of hiring our very first people and culture managers. So there are a lot of very cool insights that I'm going to take with me. So thanks for that. For everyone who is listening to this webinar, if you have any questions still for one of us, we are all active on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out. You will also get the recording of this webinar in a bit, so that you can check it out again. And again, thanks very much, guys, for being here today with me.
Thank you, Charlotte. Bye-bye.
Cool. Ciao.